It is my pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Jim Garbarino, and welcome him back to Cornell and the Bronfenbrenner Center. I'll say a few words about Jim, if he doesn't mind, and we look forward greatly to his talk. Now, most of you know Jim was a graduate student of Uri Bronfenbrenner when he was here as a graduate student, and Jim's scholarly work and career certainly embody the principle of the ecology of human development theory so much associated with Uri. And in many research areas in which Jim has worked, he has emphasized the role of personal developmental histories of people in the social and cultural context in which the life course developed and is shaped. For Jim, this has not been a purely theoretical exercise. From the beginning of his career, he's ventured well beyond the walls of the university, often to difficult and troubled places which are toxic to the healthy development of children and youth. But Jim has also been a very optimistic person, seeing many examples of resilience and hope in the face of adversity. And the work Jim will discuss today exemplifies all these themes, and we're pleased he can be here to discuss his new book, Miller's Children, which is an extraordinary work about young people mostly seen by others as hopeless or deranged or psychopathic or simply too dangerous to have walking out there among us. Jim, as only he can, brings the human quality out in these individuals based on over 20 years as an expert witness in these murder trials. By doing so, he opens the door to understanding, but also perhaps compassion. This book completes a trilogy of books starting with Lost Boys in 1999 and Listening to Killers in 2015. And I think is there copies available of the book here or at the downstairs? The bookstore will be selling books. If you're interested, please stop downstairs after the talk. Early reviews have called the book riveting and a beautifully written book, destined to become a classic in the field of criminology as well as human development. And I'm sure much of his praise will soon follow. Just a few more words about Jim before I turn the mic over to him. He currently holds the Maud C. Clark Chair in Humanistic Psychology and was the founding director of the Center for the Human Rights of Children at Loyola University in Chicago. Previously, he was the Elizabeth Lee Vinson Professor of Human Development and Director of the Family Life Development Center here at Cornell. He's received many awards in his career. The National Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect honored him in 1985 with his first C. Henry Kemp Award in recognition of his efforts on behalf of abused and neglected children. The American Psychological Association, he received an award for distinguished professional contributions to public service in 1989. And in 2011, he received the Max Heyman Award from the American Psychiatric Association for his contributions to the prevention of genocide. So with that, I'm very pleased to welcome Jim, and I'll turn the mic over to him. Thanks for coming.
I was reuniting with some of my friends and colleagues here and realizing that many of us have reached the stage where to call them old friends becomes redundant. But they haven't changed to me, of course, standing still. It's really delightful to be back at Cornell. As you heard, I was a graduate student here. I have 2 graduate degrees from Cornell. I'm technically an emeritus professor from Cornell. My daughter went here as a student and is now the head coach of the women's equestrian team. So go red horses. I don't know what you say about that. So I want to talk to you about the work that underlies this book, Miller's Children. The subtitle is Why Giving Teenage Killers a Second Chance Matters for All of Us. And as John suggested, this grows out of now almost 25 years as a psychological expert witness in murder cases. Most of the people who serve as expert witness in murder cases are clinical psychologists, and they bring just that. They offer up diagnoses, and then they sort of leave the room. As a developmental psychologist, it's been a sort of interesting path to be involved in that world in a way that is really unusual. It very often involves starting out by defending why I'm a developmental psychologist sitting in the courtroom, not what they're used to seeing. But the issues today we're going to talk about are primarily, fundamentally developmental issues. And it's developmental psychology, broadly defined, that laid the groundwork for this work, laid the groundwork for the Supreme Court decisions that stimulated this work. And clinical psychologists have been sort of marginalized in this process. So, for example, I was testifying in one of these cases recently of a resentencing of a guy who had committed a murder as an adolescent, and the state psychologist was asked, what is your expertise in developmental psychology? And he said, I think I took a course in that in graduate school once. And that was about the extent of it. And his report really lacked a developmental perspective entirely. So that's the background for this. It's bringing something. I think Yuri would have been pleased of this. I'm still craving his approval after all these years. I think he'd approve of this. I want to start with a kid. It's 1996, and a 16-year-old named Bobby has killed 2 people. The press reports of this grisly crime throw around terms like evil, monster. And because of the state law where he was located, he received an automatic, mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Now, at the time he received this sentence, a clinical psychologist did evaluate him. And I want to read you a couple of things that the psychologist said about 16-year-old Bobby. He said, quote, "The underlying pathology which is apparent from this young man's crime is likely to become more severe as he ages," unquote. And, quote, "This person is not amenable to treatment or rehabilitation," unquote. That was the psychologist translating the popular view that he was an evil monster into a more sort of clinical assessment. Now, as I said, this kid committed the crime in 1996, and that was at a time, some of you are old enough to remember that time, when there was sort of a moral panic gripping America about teenage violence. Teenage violent behavior rates had gone up, teenage homicide rates had gone up, and this sort of moral panic seized the country. And it was organized around a particular term that a guy at Rutgers University proposed. He proposed that these kids were, quote, super predators. And the idea was that there were these remorseless, conscienceless, malignant kids who were coming on the scene, and the expectation was that their numbers would grow and grow and grow. And so we had to do something. And part of what legislatures decided to do about it was to just declare them incapable of rehabilitation and unworthy of anything other than being consigned to prison for the rest of their lives. And so all around the country in states, these laws were passed that provided mandatory life without parole. There was no discretion for the judge. It was, a kid did this, bam, off you go. And Bobby was one of those kids. Now, if nothing else had changed since then, Bobby would have disappeared into the prison system because although the sentence is called life without parole, or LWOP as people often abbreviate it, it's really better understood as a death in prison sentence, because that's what it is. It's that you're going to die in prison. And the only people who would know about him might be any remaining family or friends who continued to take an interest in him. His mother might continue to write him or see him. His father might visit him. But it's the end. It's a bit like going to a doctor and being told, here's a death sentence because of prostate cancer or pancreatic cancer, whatever it is. But of course, on the other hand, all of us live with the death sentence. Last I heard, nobody has avoided dying. And as you see, that insight that all of us are temporary creatures on the planet, turns out to be one of the big stories here. But that comes later. So here's Bobby sitting in prison starting in 1996. In America, of course, and by international standards, the idea of mandatory life without parole for teenagers is, in most modern societies, would be considered barbaric. Or, they think we were talking about the 15th century, not the 20th century. And in fact, these debates continue to occur in the United States in a kind of primitive way that is literally shocking to people in other countries. It's as if, for example, in Northern Europe, they're debating Apple computers versus PCs. And here in the United States, we're not sure about the abacus. And that's a little racy for us, the abacus. That's how primitive the thinking is about this. But there has been movement. There was a case in the Supreme Court that said it was unconstitutional to give life sentences to teenagers who committed just delinquent crimes. And then eventually there was a decision in Roper versus Simmons in 2005 that said it was unconstitutional to give juveniles death sentences. I mean, not death in prison sentences, but execution sentences. And so there was something moving through the Supreme Court. Now, it wasn't overwhelming. A lot of these decisions are 5-4, and the same four were usually the four, the sort of barbaric four, I like to call them. One of them has since died, but our president made every effort to replace him with somebody who could join the barbaric four. But all through this, the years passed. Bobby continued to live out his time in prison. But then in 2012, something happened that affected Bobby's life. The Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called Miller versus Alabama that said it was unconstitutional to give juveniles mandatory life without parole sentences. Didn't extend to discretionary life without parole sentences. That's still okay. But the court said, you can't just impose it as a mandatory thing. You've got to look at the individual kid and then send him away for the rest of his life. And because of this decision and follow-up decisions, there was Montgomery versus Louisiana, there was Tatum versus Arizona, this critical Miller decision became retroactive, and it became to apply to the whole country. Now, different states responded to this with legislation to conform to this ruling. In some cases, it took litigation to conform the state's behavior. But what it did was to say to all of these guys, and there are thousands of them in this condition, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 guys around the country. Again, they're mostly guys. 90% or more of murders are committed by males, has been, still is, probably will continue. So not surprisingly, 90-something% of these guys who, because their fate has been changed by the Miller decision, we call Miller's children. You often hear these called Miller's cases. All of a sudden, a possibility opened up for them that they thought was not there. And so all across the country, these guys have been given the right to resentencing hearings. And in the resentencing hearing, the court is supposed to try to look at them as they should have looked at them when they were teenagers, look at them now, and impose a new sentence. And the range of what has happened ranges from one case I worked on where the guy went to court, the judge said, "You've served enough," and the next day he walked out of court a free man, somebody who was expecting to spend his whole life there. At the other end, and with grim frequency, judges are simply reimposing life without parole sentences. This case of Tatum versus Arizona was interesting because the first 6 cases that came up in Arizona, the judges simply reapplied life without parole, and they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "Wait a minute, that's not what we meant. How can all of your cases be the rare cases for which this is appropriate?" So this whole field is generating, it's in flux, all these things are happening. But because I had been working on murder cases for many years, and because I had some expertise in adolescent development and was a developmental psychologist, I started to be drawn into these Miller resentencing cases. And I've now worked on about 50 of them. In Illinois, in Florida. Florida is huge when it comes to this. In South Carolina, in Georgia, and Oregon. And being involved in these cases has given me an opportunity to see something that Yuri might have called an experiment of nature, because it's about what happened to these guys when they went to prison with the expectation they would never leave, with, in a sense, no motivation to engage in change or transformation or rehabilitation. And yet now, in many cases, 20 years later, this experiment has changed the terms, and now we can look at what happened to them, what they did, what they became. Now, in the case of Bobby, I worked on his case. I interviewed him in 2016 in the lead up to his resentencing hearing. And this is what I wrote about him 20 years after he was thought to be a lost cause. He said, quote, I said, quote, he is now a well-functioning moral agent, stable psychologically, and demonstrating insight into the origins of his developmental issues and the role of family dynamics in pushing him off course as a teenager. He's a normal 36-year-old man. He's a safe 36-year-old man to be released. And in fact, he will be released soon. Well, what the court told us to look at, and as a sort of Cornell issue, one of the biggest influences on what the court did was somebody I went to graduate school with. Some of you probably know Larry Steinberg, who's another Cornell product. Larry was pivotal to the amicus brief that went before the Supreme Court about this, and still has reverberating influence. The court said the reason why teenagers who commit murder should be a special legal category is at least 5 things, and they're often now called the Miller factors. The first one of them, and I'll read what the court's own language, because, quote, immaturity, impetuosity, less capacity to consider future consequences, and related characteristics that impair juveniles' ability to make decisions. So the court recognized that teenagers are different from adults, particularly when it comes to making decisions. And the 2 processes that they focused on are, 1, executive function, which is the ability to make good decisions, think clearly about consequences, weigh the risks and benefits, things that teenagers as a class are not very good at typically. This is one reason why some people have suggested teenagers should be put in protective custody and kept in protective custody until they age out of it. And the other factor is called affective regulation or emotional regulation, managing feelings. And some of this is tied into, as the court recognized, the immaturity of adolescent brains. That the frontal lobe and the parts of the brain that are engaged in doing executive function are not fully mature till the mid-20s. The fact that the part of the brain that moderates the intensity of feelings reaches its peak at about age 14. So everything feels more intense, positive or negative, and that only gradually tapers off. So the court recognized there are things about the way teenagers process information, process the world, process their internal states that should be taken into account in giving them a sort of break. The recognition they're not playing with the full deck. The second thing the court identified in the Miller ruling, the second Miller factor, is, quote, a family and home environment from which a child cannot extricate himself or herself. So they recognize that the family context that you come out of, that you come through, has an impact on your capacity and motivation and inclination to behave pro-socially, to behave effectively. Now, one way this has been translated is through the use of an instrument that's called the Adverse Childhood Experience Scale. I see some of you nodding. This is a list of 10 questions about adversity in your childhood growing up. It includes everything from parental separation and divorce, to having parents who have substance abuse problems, to witnessing domestic violence, to being the target of physical or sexual or psychological maltreatment, to experiencing neglect. And the brilliance of these 10 questions, relatively straightforward questions, is that the score from 0 to 10 accounts for about half of the variation in suicidal thoughts and behavior, in substance abuse, in depression, about 40% of the variance in aggressive behavior, let alone all the health effects, life expectancy, cardiovascular issues, asthma, on down the line. Now, I mention it here because this has become one way to implement what the court talked about when they said a family and home environment. And indeed, while 2/3 of Americans get a score of 0 or 1 on this adverse childhood experience, the average score for guys in this category is 7. And a score of 7 on this adverse childhood experience scale puts you in the worst 1% of people. Many of these guys have scores of 8, 9, and 10, which puts you in the worst 1/10 of 1%. So establishing that they're in a toxic adverse family is half of this factor. The second factor is to show that where are they supposed to go? That if they jump out of the frying pan of a toxic family, they're likely to end up in the fire of the child welfare system or the streets or a gang. I was interviewing a guy recently whose father was chronically abusing his mother. And finally, at age 12, he couldn't take it anymore. So the boy went and got a baseball bat to protect his mother. And after he attacked his father, he could never go home again. And he's out on the streets at 12. Given the community he was in, it was not long before a gang, the local version of the Crips, welcomed him into their ranks. And it's 4 years later that he is involved in a murder. So the court said we need to have a sort of analytic as well as compassionate view that kids in toxic families don't have the kind of options that they might have as adults. The third factor was, quote, the circumstances of the offense, including the role the youth played and the influence of peer pressure. Now, the circumstance of the offense includes a wide range of considerations. There is something within most legal systems called felony murder. And to be convicted of a felony murder, you don't need to kill anybody. You just need to be part of a crime in which somebody is killed. And so there are cases where, John and I are on our way to rob the 7-Eleven and we're packing heat. And on the way, we see our friend Martha here, who's, at this point, she's 16, just a couple of years ago. And we say, Martha, you want to come with us? And Martha says, sure, I'll go. Well, let's ride. So she gets in the car. We go to the 7-Eleven. And much to her surprise, John and I shoot and kill the clerk. Martha is now guilty of murder. And many of Miller's children are exactly in that situation, now serving life without parole for making the mistake of following John and I in the car to the 7-Eleven.
Never follow me in jail.
No, we're...
Story of my life.
So that's one aspect of what they mean by the role the youth played. The other issue they point out is the influence of peer pressure. And even that is not really the whole story because, there's a very interesting study, many of you probably know it, that peer presence alone can deteriorate the quality of adolescent behavior. There's a study where 16-year-olds are put in a driving simulator and they're told if you stop when the light turns yellow, you win a prize. And here's the prize. The kid says, great, I really want that prize. So you put them in the simulator and they're very good at winning the prize. But then you simply put their two best friends sitting next to them in the simulator. Their friends don't have to say anything. They don't have to say, come on, speed up. Just being there. And the kids start running the yellow lights. That peer presence is enough to deteriorate their function. So the court recognized that with teenagers, this peer dimension is particularly important. There was analysis some years ago about mass murderers that found that whereas adult mass murderers often are the classic lone wolf, teenage mass murderers typically have some dimension of peer support for what they do. Either they do it together, they have a friend who's supporting them in this. It's one reason why after many school shootings, ultimately another kid gets indicted because he knew or he encouraged or he, even though he wasn't there shooting. The fourth thing that considered a Miller factor is, quote, impaired legal competency that puts juveniles at a disadvantage in dealing with police or participating in legal proceedings. The number of 16-year-olds who are asked to make decisions like, do you want to plead guilty to murder and take this or risk going to trial, is enormous. The research on false confessions shows that teenagers are particularly likely to make false confessions. You sit them in an interrogation room for 12 hours and you say, look, just help us out here and you can go home to your mother. And a lot of kids say, yeah, I want to go home to mom. Where do I sign? And they're signing a confession. So in their dealings with the police and their dealings with legal decision-making, the court said they're at a disadvantage there as well. And finally, the court said the fifth Miller factor was, quote, the use potential for rehabilitation. The potential for rehabilitation. So typically in a Miller resentencing case, all of these issues are potentially relevant. And usually when you do a report, you organize it in part around these 5 Miller factors. Were they present? So how did Bobby, the 16-year-old evil monster, get to be Bobby, the normal, safe person? In fact, I should point out that some of these guys, it's not just that they get to be safe and normal, some of them become extraordinary human beings. Human beings that would make you proud to be part of the human race. And that itself is a very interesting story of how that happens. Well, but how does this happen? How does this rehabilitation and transformation happen? Well, it starts from the fact in Bobby's case, as it does in others, that he was 16 when he committed the crime, 17 when he started his sentence, and it took 10 years roughly for his brain to mature. And it's very common to find in these cases that by the time these guys get to be about 26, when their brains have matured, they stop behaving badly, that they stop engaging in oppositional defiant behavior in the prison, they start no longer getting written up for offenses. It's as if now that they're playing with a full deck, they use that full deck to deal a better hand to themselves. And what they do is they get involved in education. If you ever took an undergraduate philosophy course, maybe you remember your professor saying, philosophy will be useful for the rest of your life. And you probably didn't believe him. But it turns out philosophy is useful for your life. And one of the resources that these guys flock to is the study of philosophy and humanistic psychology. Some of you may know the book, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. Frankl was a Holocaust survivor who had to make sense of the world after the Holocaust. I can't tell you the number of guys who read that book and say, I get it. You have to search and create meaning in the midst of this sort of personal Holocaust that you're living. So more broadly, any kind of education, they start to read, they start to write. And writing is part of this process for them. James Pennebaker did research that showed that writing about trauma is more therapeutic than just talking about trauma. So they start writing. A guy sent me his autobiography recently from prison. It's called The Excruciating History of Seymour Sanchez. And the choice of excruciating in his case was very appropriate. But the mere act of writing his autobiography has helped him build a mind, build a consciousness, which in a prison is one of the only defenses you have against the toxicity of the environment. So as their brain matures, their capacity for effective executive function increases, their capacity for affective regulation increases, and you see this played out in a series of activities. They start getting an education formally if they can. They get associate degrees. One of my guys, just completed a bachelor's degree in theology. And on it goes. The number of law clerks who are being produced in these environments is enormous, which is good news for them because a couple of them, when they've finally been released, they go right into full-time jobs with law firms as law clerks. In fact, I have a couple that I rely upon to keep track of the latest decisions for me, and they send them to me because I don't have time to read all the legal documentation. They engage in reflection. The Dalai Lama, I'm sure you've all heard of the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama wakes up every day and spends an hour meditating on death, meditating on non-existence, in order that he be grounded in a better way in existence. And some of these guys take up meditation. Sometimes they have access to therapeutic programs. Now, I should point out that one of the injustices in all of this is that in many prisons, these guys are ineligible to participate in therapeutic or educational programs. Because the prison says, well, you're not never leaving, why should we waste resources on you? And if they are eligible, they're typically put at the bottom of the priority list. So for them to participate represents a persistence and a craving for improvement. Sometimes they have the experience of mentoring. An older inmate takes them under their wing and tries to help them navigate and avoid some of the negative temptations. They engage in positive activities. They get certificates as a plumber, electrician, as I said, a law clerk. There's a sense in which when you get one of these sentences, you have to make a decision at some point to live in the prison either as a monk or as a savage barbarian. And the ones who are able to choose to be a monk assemble this alternative consciousness, this alternative mind. Now, it's interesting that mentoring, positive work, and therapy appear on this list because there's a psychologist in Chicago, Robert Zager. Zager developed the most effective assessment algorithm for predicting future violent behavior, whereas most such predictive instruments are lucky if they're 70% accurate. His is 90-something% accurate. We've actually used it in some of these cases to document this person is now safe. But there was an experimental program done in Chicago where they identified the 1,000 kids most at risk of committing murder based on this algorithm, and then they gave them 3 programmatic elements: anger management, mentoring, and a jobs program. And they cut the number of murders in half. So it's interesting that some of these guys in prison have on their own put together that same package of interventions. All of that leads to transformation and rehabilitation. Of course, the regular research on resilience is relevant here as well, because there's a sense in which this is a resilience issue. And some of the things that come up as factors underlying resilience are at least average intellectual ability. And it's very clear it helps to be smart if you're one of Miller's children. Having at least one person who's crazy about you. Now, Yuri would have loved that. That was one of his big themes, having someone who's crazy about you. And you hear that. It's a grandma, it's a brother, it's someone who sticks with you in a loving relationship through all of this horror. And that becomes a kind of anchor. Also on the resilience list is having some special talent or ability. And you see that sometimes. They cultivate something. The number of amazing artists who are locked away, the number of amazing novelists who are locked away, it's a national disgrace in many ways. So you have those resilience factors. Then you also have the fact that some of these kids have committed murders as part of what is really best understood as an adolescent crisis. That it's not intrinsic to who they are, but situations arise, conspire, there's peer influence, there's a crisis in the family, and the adolescent crisis, unfortunately, precipitates in a murder. And many of them, the crisis passes. They move away from the crisis as they mature. So there's a lot of things going on here that would make it understandable why Miller's children would, over a period of time, progress to the point where they were safe, where they were normal, and some of them are extraordinary. But the Supreme Court recognized that there are exceptions, that not every teenager is able to go along this pathway. The language that they used, the Supreme Court used, was they said that life without parole is appropriate. They said, quote, for the rarest of juvenile offenders, those whose crimes reflect permanent incorrigibility. Now, as you'll see in a minute, I think this statement, which has become central to this whole process, is fundamentally flawed. The good part of it is they say the rarest of juvenile cases. And so in Arizona, simply reimpose life on the first 6 resentencing, the Supreme Court said, no, how can all of your cases be the rarest cases? It's just not possible. And so it's gotten to the point now where when we go to court, we say to the judge, Judge, you need to understand that what the court is saying is the burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defense. The burden of proof should be on the prosecution to show that this is one of the rarest cases. That's good. But the second part of the statement, I think, is fundamentally flawed. When they say those whose crimes reflect permanent incorrigibility, I think they're saying something that is simply not true. because there is, as far as I can tell, no evidence that the nature of a teenager's crime, the severity of their crime, positively correlates with their prospects for rehabilitation and transformation. There's a sense in which it's almost irrelevant to that. And so when the court says the rarest cases are those whose crimes reflect permanent incorrigibility, I think it's an empty category. Teenagers' crimes, with very few exceptions, do not reflect anything about their incorrigibility. Some of the most grotesque murders have been committed by teenagers who actually have had the best prognosis for recovery. One group that stands out are school shooters. In general, school shooters commit horribly severe crimes, but in fact are the most rehabilitatable among juvenile killers to a large degree. I know one of them at 15, I know several of them, but one at 15 killed his parents, went to school, killed 4 people at school, wounded 6 others. What could be worse than that? 20 years later, he is a remarkably safe, aware, potentially productive citizen. On the other hand, I've met kids who committed a murder very almost casually or coincidentally, who really are some of these exceptions. Well, who are the exceptions? Who are the kids that even a bleeding heart like me doesn't think are going to make it? Well, there seem to be 2 groups. And if you get Miller's Children, you see there's a whole chapter called Are There Exceptions? One group are the kids who are so profoundly damaged because of the accumulation of profound early trauma that I don't think we know how to make them better. You know, in the field of trauma, I think one of the pivotal articles was done some years ago by 2 researchers, Barbara Solomon and Kathleen Heide. And they looked at 3 kinds of trauma. Trauma 1 was a single incident of trauma. I remember after the couple of years after the attacks on 9/11 in New York City, we had students here as undergraduates who had been in high school within eyeshot of the trade towers. And I remember interviewing a couple of them. And it was a really bad day. But the research on type 1 trauma, the single incident, basically says that within a year, usually 90% are back to as good as they were before, because there's a kind of inevitable, almost inevitable, therapy of reassurance that takes place. Things are back to normal, and kids recalibrate. There's psychological first aid. So that's type 1. Type 2 that Solomon and Heidi talked about was where you have multiple incidents of trauma. Some people call that complex trauma. And it's complex in the sense that the process of dealing with it is more complex, because you can't simply say it's okay, it's over, things are back to normal, because there could be another shooting. There was one 2 months ago, there'll be another one next month. And so it's a much more complex task to deal with that developmental challenge. Then they talked about what they call type 3 trauma, which is severe chronic trauma in the first 3 or 4 years of life, when the fundamental building blocks of a human being are being put together. And their concern was that people who experience type 3 trauma are typically so profoundly damaged that for them to recover requires a massive, sophisticated intervention starting in childhood. Now, in their article, I think it's really quite interesting. They have a chart where they say, here are the consequences of type 1, type 2, and type 3 trauma. For type 1 trauma, they say, well, the first consequence is you see a narrative memory, a narrative account of the traumatic event. It's not surprising. It really stands out. You talk to some kid who watched the planes hit the World Trade Center, yeah, they can tell you about it in vivid detail. The other thing they find is they often have some symptoms of what's called post-traumatic stress disorder. I really don't like that term because it pathologizes what is actually a normal human response to a terrible event. I really want to change the D so it's post-traumatic stress development, because that's the real issue. How do you develop going forward from trauma? And the answer with type 1 trauma is pretty darn good. What about type 2 trauma, where it's repeated? Well, they say that what you typically find is the narrative memory starts to deteriorate, because it's hard to keep track which traumatic event was which. And then you find your PTSD. But in addition, they point out that you find a couple of other consequences. You find poor self-esteem and self-concept. That if you're multiply traumatized, it's hard not to escape the conclusion, what's wrong with me? You know that old Texas expression that George Bush mangled in public that says, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Now he said, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on you again. I don't know. He was from Texas, English was the second language, what do you expect? But the validity of it is clear here, that the reason that you see poor self-esteem and self-concept with multiple trauma is it almost inevitably induces the thought there's something wrong with you. They also found interpersonal distrust, not surprising, feelings of shame, and dependency. Obviously, I can't manage my own life. I keep getting traumatized. Somebody please take over and help me out here. But for type 3 trauma, this profound assault on the fundamental processes of changing a biological infant organism into a human personality, they find 23 consequences. And they include, on the right page, I thought I'd fumble with my notes so you'd all think of Yuri here. This is one of Yuri's scenes. This is a paper from Those of you who remember him, we would have a pool about how long it would take before his shirt tail would be out like this. Some of you remember that? That was when I was a graduate student. That was a big thing. Anyway, so here's what they found. The first thing they found was that the narrative memory of the trauma, absent. Not surprising, who can remember stuff about when they were 2 years old? You might remember an episodic event at 3, but you don't have narrative memories. So it's not surprising you don't have that. PTSD, of course. But in addition, denial, repression, emotional numbing, poor self-esteem, self-concept, interpersonal distrust, superficial relationships, high anxiety, chronic depression, suicidal thoughts and behavior, feelings of shame, foreshortened sense of the future, dependency, rage, affective, emotional dysregulation, substance abuse, self-injury, narcissism, impulsivity, identity confusion, and dissociative symptoms. Now, what's left? Now, one consequence of this is that these guys typically are not defined as victims because they can't give you a memory of their victimization. What they're defined as is psychiatric symptoms and diagnoses. One guy I worked on, fell into this category. At 31, in his records, he had 10 different psychiatric diagnoses. He had schizoaffective disorder and borderline personality and antisocial personality disorder and depression and suicidal thoughts and feelings, possible pedophilia. There's 11 diagnoses. What was happening for him was, it was like that old parable about the blind men being asked to describe an elephant. One feels the leg of the elephant and says, oh, this is a tree. Another one feels the trunk of an elephant and says, this is a snake. Another one feels the tail of the elephant and says, this is a rope. That's exactly what these clinicians had been doing with this guy for years, but not one of them offered what was the central diagnosis, which was type 3 trauma. So I'm spending a little time talking about that because I think this is one of the groups of exceptions. These guys who experienced type 3 trauma, who were just obliterated. They don't develop any kind of secure attachment. They may have, reactive attachment disorder, if you want to diagnose it as something. They have profound distrust. They have all of this stuff going on in their heads. So for them to get better represents starting from scratch. A guy once said to me, he said, how am I supposed to rehabilitate if I was never habilitated in the first place? And that's right to point. Whereas if you had an adequate childhood, you have something to go back to, something to build upon. And this class of guys typically do not have that. The other group are the budding psychopaths. Now, of course, many people now prefer the term sociopath. If you look at the work of Robert Hare, who's sort of the grandfather of psychopathy, he doesn't think they should be used interchangeably, and I agree. Let me give you an example of why. If you walked into this room before the lecture, nobody else was here, and you found a $100 bill on the floor, would you have a moral problem about taking it? Now, honestly, most people wouldn't. There might be a few exemplars who would bring it down to the front desk and say, I found this $100 bill. If somebody comes looking for it, it's theirs. But most normal moral agents would take the $100 bill. But if you walked into the room and you saw that Martha here had dropped a $100 bill out of her pocket onto the floor, most normal moral agents would say, Martha, I don't even know you, but that must be your $100 bill. Fair enough. A sociopath? No. Martha is not in the sociopath's moral circle, so he'll take her $100 bill. He may even reach in her pocket and take a $100 bill. But if Martha is his sister, or his mother, or his close friend, or his fellow gang member, he may not take her $100 bill because he does have some moral circle. But if he is a psychopath, he'll take his mother's $100 bill. No one is inside his moral circle. And so building a safe moral agent out of somebody who's a psychopath has proved to be, for the most part, impossible. Now, there's one glimmer of light here. There's a program in Minnesota that has worked with teenagers who score high on this instrument that identifies psychopaths. They don't score at the very highest level, but they score sort of the moderately high level. And they have had success in creating empathy and conscience in those kids. But it requires a program that is 3 hours a day, 6 days a week, for months and months and months, because they're starting from scratch. Now, I've interviewed guys in both of these categories. I interviewed a guy who at 23 was going to be getting a resentencing hearing because at 13 he killed his best friend. But when you listen to how his thinking that led up to the killing of his best friend, he was very open about the fact that he had studied for 2 years to start his career as a serial killer. You know, and some 11-year-olds, I guess, want to be a cop or a fireman or an astronaut. He decided he wanted to be a serial killer, and he studied. It's one reason why he used a knife. He said he'd learned that serial killers typically use knives, not guns. And so before he could begin his career, he had to take care of the two people who knew what he was planning, his best friend and his sister. So the day after his 13th birthday, he went to school and killed his best friend using the knife. And then he was planning to kill his sister later that afternoon so he could start free and clear on his career as a serial killer. He was caught before he got a chance to kill his sister. But 10 years later, I don't think he had changed at all. He was just shifting his reference points. You know, there was a very famous study in Canada that sought to teach empathy skills to prisoners, with the idea that if you teach them empathy skills, you'll improve their ability to form successful relationships. Makes a lot of sense. When they analyzed the data, they found that for the non-psychopath prisoners, it worked. They improved their empathy skills and their relationships improved. The psychopaths treated it as a workshop on how to improve manipulation skills. Oh, I see. That's what you look like when you're sad. I will use that sadness against you. So when the Supreme Court said that only the very rarest of cases, I think these are the two categories they're talking about. How rare are they? I don't think we have a number yet. The best I can offer is I've worked on 50 cases, and I've had 3, one psychopath and 2 type 3 trauma cases who I don't think are going to make it. So maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's 6%. That would be pretty rare. And it's conceptually consistent. So all of this is going on. These cases are being seen and heard, but there are some issues that continue to reverberate through all of this. One of them is this fundamental problem that the Supreme Court has made worse, that you can predict from a teenager's murder whether or not he's going to rehabilitate later on. That it is not the crime. It is not the nature of the crime. It is the context surrounding the crime, inside and outside that person. Number 2, why does this stop at 18? The Supreme Court set a line. If you're 18, you reach your 18th birthday, all bets are off. You're no longer in that category. Now, Larry Steinberg recently was saying that he regrets that he went along with saying 18, because the research is very clear that it isn't you turn 18, ba-da, you have a mature brain. You still got 8 more years to mature that brain. So one of the big pressures around the country is to move the age up from 18 that these issues apply to. Now, California has, by legislation, moved it up to 25. In Illinois, we had a state Supreme Court decision that accepted up to 23. This is affecting the life without parole issues. It's also affecting the juvenile death penalty. Cases are now being filed to say that a 19-year-old should be ineligible for the death penalty because they're still in this process. I was working on a case recently where the court turned it down and the guy was executed last week. But we got a couple more in the hopper here. I was in Florida recently, and the prosecutor was incredulous, thought this was ridiculous, just because California did it, that Florida would do this. I said, well, do you have turning right on a red light here in Florida? He said, yeah. I said, you know who had that first? California. So maybe it's coming east. So that's an issue, pushing that age up. And I get letters from guys in prison who committed crimes at 18, 19, 20, 21 weekly, asking for help in pushing that on their behalf. The third big issue that's swirling around is what's going on with these judges and prosecutors that they fight this tooth and nail? I think there are a couple of things going on. One is pure judicial cowardice. They don't want to be the judge who's viewed as being soft on crime. They don't want to be the judge who releases somebody who commits a crime. To my knowledge, and I may be wrong about this, no Miller's child who's ever been released yet, and there aren't that many of them, has ever committed another crime. So I think so far their record is spotless. I may have missed something. But there's more than just this fear of political consequences. There's also a lot of ego investment. Often it's the same judge being asked to hear the resentencing who did the original sentencing. And it's the same prosecutor often. For them to say, you know, we shouldn't have had a life without parole, requires a kind of decentered ego state that a lot of them don't seem to be capable of. The nastiness, the vindictiveness, the sarcasm that comes out of the mouths of these prosecutors on this issue and then is echoed back by the judges is very disturbing. But there's even more. There's a guy in Kansas named Saucier who's been studying the effect of believing in absolute evil. And the basic finding of his work is if you believe in absolute evil, you are unwilling and unable to perceive mitigating evidence. So if a judge believes in absolute evil, all the mitigating evidence, all the explanation counts for nothing because they literally won't perceive it. They don't hear it. And even if they hear it, they don't think it's relevant. One of these cases recently, this judge was listening day after day, oh, so sympathetic, yes, At the end said, you know, it's really wonderful what this guy has done. He paused and reimposed life without parole. That his mind doesn't have space in it for this. I think, actually, judges who can be identified as having belief in absolute evil should not be allowed to serve on the bench because they can't process the information that the law says they're supposed to process. And then the prosecutors often, you know, again, it's very ego-driven on their part. Another issue that's swirling around in all this is that in many cases, the quote, the problem is the victim's family, that they get locked into sadness and rage about the crime and the loss of their loved one and never get to the point where they can allow the possibility of somebody being rehabilitated and released. Now, it's asking a lot, but there is research that shows that for the victim's family, forgiveness is healing for them. Now, not casual forgiveness, oh, you killed my brother last week, have a nice day. But going through a process that leads to forgiveness is so healing for these victims' families that it's in their self-interest to do, and more needs to be done to process that so they then can enable the release of some of these guys. Because in some cases, that's what's holding it back. Another issue is people are unaware of the plasticity of adult brains. A lot of people know about the immature brains and the baby brains and early childhood brains. But if you read a book like Norman Doidge's book, The Brain That Changes Itself, modern neuroscience has demonstrated that even adult brains are malleable. And if you engage in different behavior, your brain adapts to that. The worst negative example is a whole chapter in his book on hardcore pornography. That watching hard pornography doesn't just change your feelings about sex, it rewires sexual stimulation in your brain. And that can be, that's typically a negative thing, but if you engage in 10,000 hours of meditation, it changes your brain in a positive way. If you engage in education and reflection and all these other writing, your brain adapts to that. So some of these guys, they started with an immature brain at 16, and now at 36, they have not just a mature brain, but an advanced brain, because they've lived as a monk for all those years. So one question becomes, how far can that plasticity go? My concern is that for psychopaths, we don't seem to know how to make their brains change enough in a positive direction for the most part. And with these profoundly damaged type 3 trauma cases, it's not clear that we know how to do that either. Now, there are guys who get 10 on the ACE score who 20 years later have done it, but it's really a remarkable accomplishment given what they've had to deal with. And one of the breakthroughs is often realizing that they had to deal with something heavy. When I give this ACE score, I'll say to them, all right, you got a score of 8. So I say, if we gave this to 100 guys in your neighborhood, how many do you think would get a score of about 8? And they say, oh, out of 100, 95, maybe 100. I say, what if we gave it to a random sample of guys from across the country, 2 from every state? And they'll say, oh, I don't know, 50 out of 100. And I say, well, actually, it's not 50 out of 100, it's 1 out of 1,000. I said this to a guy recently, and he began to cry. He began to cry when, for the first time, his level of suffering was sort of located in the human universe. And it's an important step, because it allows you to start saying, I'm not just a terrible, lousy, loser person. I had to deal with a lot of adversity, and that can look forward. So that's very encouraging. And then the plastic brain finds. Another big issue that's swirling around is we still have discretionary life without parole for teenagers. I think we're going to get there, but again, it's by modern standards, we're barbaric on this. In Norway, the maximum sentence for any crime is 22 years. Any crime. And after 22 years, the state can apply to extend it for 5 years if they can show you're really still a threat. But so I sometimes say to these guys, your first mistake, you weren't born in Norway. And you've compiled on other mistakes ever since. The last issue, because I know we're about at the end of the time. So what is the appropriate sentence for these guys? Judges all over America are imposing sentences that are incredible. The case of a kid in Indiana I was working on, the judge imposed 90 years. He said it's not a death penalty, it's 90 years. And then under Indiana law, if the crime occurs as part of a gang, it automatically doubles the sentence. So now he's got 180 years, but it's still not a life sentence. Getting at these sentencing decisions to put them in some appropriate developmental framework is still a big agenda. But if they ask, what is the right sentence? I used to have an almost ideological view that all juveniles should be dealt with in a juvenile. The more I've done this over these years, I've moved away from that. There's one important piece of evidence, and that was a study in Florida of kids who committed murder as teenagers, were treated as juveniles, and they got 9-year sentences. That was the maximum. Now, you're 16, you get 9 years, that means you're released when you're 25. The recidivism rate for those kids for committing violent crimes was over 90%. So what I've sort of come to the point of saying that many of the sentences are too long or too short. That if we can do an assessment, say this is a kid whose crime reflects a short-term adolescent crisis, we can have some confidence that they can recover from that crisis, rebuild, and they can be dealt with as a juvenile and released at 18. But if their crime reflects the fact that their larger context was one of being embedded in violent behavior, in rage, in sadness, in profound problems with executive functioning, the worst sentence is 9 years. Because then before they have a full deck, they're turned back out in the world, and lo and behold, 90% violent recidivism rate. I think the ideal sentence is either as a juvenile or 20 years. Because 20 years gets them to 26 when their brain is mature, and it gives them 10 years to use that mature brain to undergo rehabilitation and transformation. And that is so clear in looking at the lives of these guys. After that, it's usually superfluous. Now, legally and morally, there may be other considerations, but developmentally, I think it's largely superfluous. There's a kid that I've been involved in his life since he was 13. He got a 12-year sentence at 13 and killed somebody, got out at 25, and exactly what you might now predict would happen happened. That he had not used that brain that he just barely had. He was back in prison within a couple of years for another violent crime. He's getting out a couple of years from now at 37, and we'll see how he does. So this is an area that is emerging. It speaks to a lot of the most profound issues in American culture. It speaks to the fact that we live immersed in a culture in which it's hard to see things clearly. Things that are right in front of us. Now, Yuri used to like to quote, those of you who ever took or taught HD 115, he used to like to quote the German poet Goethe. And the English translation was, what is most difficult? That which you think is easiest, to see what is before your eyes. And this is a nice example of that. And I'll finish with one more study. Schizophrenics. What most people, when I think of crazy people, what they're thinking of is schizophrenics. Schizophrenics have a number of issues. One of them is that they often hear voices. It's called auditory hallucinations. Happens all over the world. Schizophrenics hear voices. But until recently, I think nobody really looked at the question of what are the voices saying? And so a study recently looked at schizophrenics' auditory hallucinations in the United States, in India, and in Ghana. Now, because we're Americans, we don't know world geography. Ghana is in Northwest Africa, just in case you didn't know. Here's what they found. In the United States, 70% of the voices of schizophrenics hear tell them to commit acts of violence against themselves or others. 70%, 7-0. In India, 20%. In India, most of the voices in people's heads tell them to do things like clean your house better. In Ghana, only 10% of the voices tell them to commit acts of violence. Mostly the voices in Ghana are perceived to be positive conversations with God. So when you think even crazy people who are supposedly disconnected from reality in America, American violent culture seeps into their heads, that's part of what we're dealing with in every decision, in every court, in every ruling, in every clinical assessment, to see what is before our eyes. Thank you. Now, John, what happens next? Now, you've got to go teach. I know you have to go.
Well, we can take some questions.
Questions. We have time. We have a few minutes for questions. Okay. Yes.
You said there's certain tests that, a lot of different tests you can give to Miller's children. But when you said, you would assure the judge or whomever that this person was safe, the first thing I thought of was, whoa, how would I feel? I'm saying this person is safe, and what if something happens? So how can you feel so confident?
Well, I have said in open court, if I'm wrong about this, I will hang up my shingle and stop doing it. The reason I feel confident is that in that prison environment, they've had years and years now of avoiding negative temptations, of behaving well, of being vouched for by people who see them day after day, week after week. Often guards will come testify on their behalf. There's a guy I know whose son was murdered, and he first went into prisons to speak the bitterness about being the parent of a dead child, and was so overwhelmed by the positive response of the guys that he now full-time works in the prison being the father figure for these guys, and they think of him as a father. So it's not a 2-hour visit. It's a long period with multiple opportunities for other people to observe, and to hear their insight onto what happened and why. That's what leads to the confidence. As I said, in some cases we have used this Zager. It's a battery of tests. It's a 3.5 hours of internet-based testing. It's got the MMPI, it's got the Beck depression or suicide thing, it's got a cognitive assessment, and this guy Zager has this proprietary algorithm that spits out a probability of violent behavior. Let's say it's 97% accurate. So in those cases, you can say it's not just me, but here's an algorithm. In one of those cases, the judge said, "No, I don't care. I don't feel like he's safe." I was like, all right. I mean, that's part of what we're up against. But that is a significant issue. And I'm actually much less comfortable with the question, should they get the adolescent sentence for 2 years or the 20-year sentence? Because I think it's much harder to know there if they're going to be okay and safe in 2 years, as opposed to 20 years down the road. And some of them are 30 years down the road. I got a call about a case, a guy who's been in for 44 years and is going to get a resentencing hearing. So, it is, and I understand, do you want to be the judge or the expert witness who vouch for somebody and then they go out and do something? But because it's not contingent on a particular assessment, but it's understanding a whole life, the level of confidence goes up. Yes?
So I'd be kind of following on that. Curious if you could say more about whether you see any role for mandatory sentencing, and particularly with regard to age categories, and the question of certainty of the ability for a person to rehabilitate. I'd just be curious if you could comment if one ever really feels, kind of in the spirit of this other question, that one knows with certainty whether someone can be rehabilitated. I guess I'm really thinking, if you have a juvenile saying, I was plotting my career as a psychopathic
serial killer,
versus if you have a 28-year-old, is there age bracketing where you would feel that mandatory life sentences or certainty around rehabilitation possibility can be invoked, or is there always uncertainty? Is there always a need for there to be?
Yeah. Well, with adults, I'm much more confident saying we now sort of know that this person is incorrigible, as the Supreme Court said. I mean, I've served on cases with like a 34-year-old psychopath who conned the prison administration into letting him work outside the prison in the garden shop. And then 3 people went missing. And it turned out he had buried them under the rose garden that he was working on. So I don't think he should be going anywhere again. He shouldn't be out in the rose garden again, for sure. So the point is that, he's sort of coalesced. Now, it is possible to change because of plasticity of adult brains, but those brains seem very, very resistant to that change. So with teenagers, I actually don't see any circumstance in which you should give a sentence that doesn't permit the possibility of parole somewhere down the line. What you ought to do is give them their 20 years, and then they can be reviewed then and see what they've shown. Now, the other thing that's tricky about this, of course, is all of these guys went to prison thinking they would never get out. So they had no motivation to sort of try to look good. And it's all the more reason why it's amazing how good they look. But if you don't have that stretching out in front of you, like this kid I was telling you who went to prison at 12, it's very clear to me that he just sort of figured, I'll bide my time, I won't really change, and then I'll get out at 25, and it'll be okay. He wasn't forced into encountering himself in the same way. That's why, there's research on people who get like a cancer diagnosis, you've got a year to live. Sort of grossly, half of them just sink into despair and hedonism, and the other half say, I'm going to make the most of these months that I have, and they lead these glorious, fulfilling lives, and often say, it's the best time I've ever had in my life. So you're sort of getting that kind of breakdown here. So I'm much more confident, because with the adult cases, I used to do mostly adult cases, and they were mostly death penalty cases. And where you could feel, all right, it's either death, execution, or it's life in prison without possibility of parole. So you could be sort of sloppy in a way there, because the only issue is, are they so dangerous if they live in prison, will they hurt other people in prison? And you know, some of those guys are very profoundly damaged, and I don't see how they would recover. I have said at times in those death penalty cases, I would conclude my testimony by saying, if this guy had been my son, rather than the son of the people he was, I don't think we'd be sitting here today, to sort of make the point that the context in which you grow up has a lot to do with, no matter how vulnerable you are. Any of you know the book by James Fallon called The Psychopath Inside? James Fallon is a neuroscientist who made part of his living viewing brain scans of psychopaths. Psychopath. And one day he looked at a scan, psychopath, turned it over, it was his brain scan. Oh my God. It took him 10 years to figure out why, although he had the brain of a psychopath, he was a good citizen, you know, a professor, a businessman, parent. And what he realized eventually, which we could have told him if he had come to Cornell, was that the context he grew up in was of stable, loving, smart parents, safe community, good schools, and it sort of protected him from his vulnerability. Now, if he admits that when he went around starting asking people about himself, people would say things, well, you know, you are a little manipulative, or things that he was sort of psychopath light, you know. And I had dinner with him once, and I had brought a copy of my book, Listening to Killers, to sign for him. And he had brought a copy of his book to sign, and I had signed mine, and he didn't have a pen. So he said, can I use your pen? So I said, sure. And he signed his book, and then he put my pen in his pocket. I said, yo, I read your book. Give me my pen back. But the point is that most of that, I think, becomes apparent by the time you're in your mid-20s. And so that's why I think the court is right. These kids are a separate and justifiably legal category. Now, there's a whole other issue about the death penalty and about life in prison. Norway's decided nobody should get life in prison, basically. And they organize their prisons based on that you should be able to be in a prison in a way that does rehabilitate you and improve you, rather than just punishes you. And so a lot flows from that. Yes?
So it's kind of directly segueing, I'm kind of curious, when we start thinking about appropriate sentencing, how we would reconcile this kind of assumption that prison can be a therapeutic experience in the American context, when politically, sort of jurisprudentially, right, punishment is sort of the modus operandi, right? Yeah. So how do we kind of pull those things together?
Well, there have been a few encouraging things that, you know, the people who run prisons, as opposed to the legislators, often they understand that anything they can do to make the prison a better environment makes them safer. And some of them go beyond that to say, you know, it will help these guys too. So for example, the people running the prison system, I think in North Dakota or something, took a field trip to Norway and came back, and they've been trying to reorganize their prison system because they said, hey, they don't have recidivism like we do. They don't have guards being attacked like we do. They don't have guards having feces thrown in the way we do. They don't have these riots that we have. So it's in our interest to reformulate this. And so that, you know, is a motive. Some of you may know the work of James Gilligan. Maybe you know Carol Gilligan, writing about female development. This is her husband, James, a psychiatrist, who was the head of mental health for the Massachusetts prison system at one point. He got this insight. It's reflected in his book. What's it called? On Killing, I think. No, that's a different book. Violence, it's called. He got this insight that what was driving so much of the violence in prison was the fact that these guys had such low self-concept that they were so prone to disrespect. And the disrespect would create a kind of prospect of psychic annihilation, and so they would burst into anger and violence. So he reorganized his prison to make it a respect-based system. And the consequence was the inmates stopped assaulting the guards almost completely, and the assaults by inmates against other inmates dropped dramatically. So there are these sort of pivotal points in the social psychology, developmental psychology of even prisons that can make a big difference. There's a group of guys in Oregon who are sort of Miller's children, who all committed their murders at about the same time within a 2-year period. They all went into a special therapeutic program for adolescent homicide perpetrators. This is now, 20 years ago. This cohort of guys. They got to them early. They got to them with very sophisticated intervention. And I go see these guys often. I've never seen a bigger group of guys serving life in prison who are more thoroughly transformed and rehabilitated because they started the process so early and they've had the peer support for it because they're a cohort that stays together. It's really quite remarkable what they have accomplished. And the way that they help each other and help each other through things and teach each other and share, it's really inspiring. Yes, is that up?
I think we're going to have to.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm just keeping track of the time.
You can email me if you have questions.
And I know there's people who have to leave, and I know they're waiting because they don't want to be rude to get up in the middle of the questions. And I also, first I want to thank Jim, and he's going to be around a bit. We're going to grab some lunch. I'm going to privilege Jim to go through the lunch line first, if you don't mind, so he can get something to eat before other people come up to him and start asking him questions during lunch or after lunch. So I'm going to get him through the line. Then please feel free to grab some food and stay around. There'll be opportunities for more conversation. There's books downstairs at the desk in the store here. If you would like to purchase a book, if you want to bring it back up, I'm sure Jim would be glad to sign it for you. But right now, let's big hand. And
Thank you.
Thank you.